Team, welcome back to another episode on the Live, Perform, Compete podcast. I mean, I've said it to my guest already, who's going to be Luke Starr, and I'll talk about him a little bit later. But first thing I'm going to talk about is just this new microphone I have. I can't stop talking about it. I've been thinking about it all day. I went down the shops yesterday and thought, it's time for a little podcast upgrade. And I purchased the cheapest microphone in the store, and it is unbelievable. So if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm going to have a massive shit-eating grin on my face all episode, just because, as you all know, I love the sound of my voice, and now I hear it even clearer. But anyway, let's introduce our guest today, Luke Starr. How you doing, buddy?
Thanks, Ed. Great to be here. Your voice sounds amazing.
Thanks, buddy.
I must say.
Starry, I'm trying to think back to where we first met. I think I first heard about you probably my first regionals when we went to Oz in 2015. And I think you were at the tail end of your individual CrossFit career.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I first caught your name, because I just thought Luke Starr's a pretty cool name. That's a hard one to forget. And then I think over the last few years in coaching, the emergence of Starr Strength, which is something you created. And I know a lot of the athletes that you work with. I mean, we had Alethea Boone on the podcast not that long ago.
Yeah.
And just kind of seeing your growth as a coach in a coaching organization has been awesome from afar. Just always wanted to get you as a guest in this podcast, because I know we think very similarly about a lot of things in coaching, and I know we're gonna have some good conversation. And I guess the last time we saw each other was at ACC. I had a few athletes competing. You were down with Alethea, and right. So it was a good catch up. But anyway, mate, what's going on your end?
Oh, thanks, Ed. I think you're right. Like, the first time was back in about 2015, and I remember you competing with your brother in the heat at the regionals that year, and
the Asian heat.
Yeah, pretty much. And I remained in that heat for the whole weekend. I didn't manage to jump up to any of the other heats, but that was good fun.
Still very impressive to be in that heat, by the way.
Oh yeah, I worked hard to get there.
So what's your story, Luke? I'd love to hear about your athletic background.
Yeah.
Your first exploration of CrossFit, and then how you've now transitioned to full-time coaching. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, well, if I can do it in that order, if you like. If I want to go way back, I played athletically. I played rugby for 15 years. So grew up playing it and did athletics as well in the summertime. Bunch of other sports, but they were the two main ones. And then in my early 20s, I played some higher level rugby, like in the Sydney Premiership competition, the Shute Shield, and a little bit overseas while I was at college in the US for a season, and also over in the UK. I played a season over there. And then I came back and had my final season in Sydney. And it was about the same time where I started to work properly in the fitness industry and started to find out a little bit about the CrossFit, actually, and started to do a couple of workouts that I was seeing on the main site. And
what year was this?
To it that way. And this was like late 2007, I think.
Oh, early days.
2008. Yeah. So pretty early. So I was working as a personal trainer at like a council-owned facility called Ian Thorpe Aquatic Centre in Sydney, and then I was at another council-operated gym where I was there for 3 years, and sort of during that time, I started to get more and more into the CrossFit scene a little bit, and I was kind of, fast forward to like 2009, there was the first ever regionals in Australia, 2009, which basically anyone could just register for and do. So I was really getting the passion, the bug for it by that point. And I had sort of given away the rugby mainly due to being busy as a personal trainer at night time, needing my nights to coach people, all that kind of stuff. So I put that to the side, didn't really intend on finishing up my rugby at that point, but never ended up really going back for a full season. And started doing the CrossFit comps. Not that there was many of them around at that time around, so it was pretty new, but we were kind of at a point where we were really into it, and we were sick of trying to do these CrossFit workouts in a normal kind of gym setting, like wanting to be able to drop weights and do things like muscle ups just wasn't really an option. And I was training with Chad McKay. Some of the listeners might know Chad from He competed a few times at the CrossFit Games, and this is before all that. But we were working together as staff at this gym, and we decided to open up a garage CrossFit affiliate so that we'd have somewhere to train. And the goal was to just get enough members to sort of pay rent, and then we'd have somewhere we could go and train. And that was the start of CrossFit Active, which was an affiliate that I was part owner of with Chad and a couple other guys. And we ended up getting a few more locations over the years. And I was involved with that as one of the owners for 6 years, from like 2009, 2010 through to 2016. And that was a time when CrossFit really gained in popularity, as a lot of you guys would know. And we had a lot of success at things like regionals, and I think we had teams going to the games and that kind of stuff. And during that whole period, I ended up competing at, I think it was 8 consecutive regionals, and 2 of them were in a team where we went over to the games and competed in a team 2013 and 14. And then around about 2016, I was doing more and more kind of work with people one-on-one, and helping with them with their, like, optimize their training for comps. And I was getting sort of more and more into that and the programming side of things. And I did get to the point where I decided that that's what I wanted to do, is like a full-time thing. And so that's when I started what I'm doing now, which is my coaching business is called Starr Strength and Performance. And the way it's kind of evolved now is that I'm pretty much working almost 100%, close to 100% of my time is working online with people. But then we also run training camps throughout the year, generally leading up to some of the bigger CrossFit events on the calendar and getting athletes ready for those. And I also do work a little bit with athletes in other sports, like weightlifting and powerlifting and fighters and things like that. But the vast majority of the people I'm working with now are people who want to treat CrossFit or fitness competitions as their sport. And here I am now, basically.
Nice. And I know on your own training journey, because I know you're still very much training pretty hard. You've had a rough old 12 months, I think it's been. You've had a couple of injuries. I think you just recently ruptured your Achilles. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think I've had a couple of warnings that I maybe need to slow down in my old age, I think. the past 12 months. So like November last year, I was competing at the Torian Pro, which is a comp here in Australia. And I was in a pairs team, and we were on a snatch ladder event, speed snatch ladder event. And I was going for a weight that was at the end of the ladder, but it was basically my 1RM. It was at like a 105 kilo snatch. And I actually dislocated my elbow, and which is a pretty nasty one. It's one of those ones you see sometimes on YouTube or something, those injuries, and you just think, oh, I would hate that to happen to me. And there I was. It was pretty horrible. And then I recovered from that, and that's been actually pretty good recovery. Thank God for that. But I was playing a game of touch football about 4 months ago, and it was the first game of the season, and I actually ruptured my Achilles tendon. Awesome. And had to go get that operated on. So that's
we spoke about it quickly at the start of the episode, and we kind of talked. We both played rugby, and I think I got probably more of the short end of the stick with injuries as a player. You managed to get through a lot of your career unscathed. But what's this process been like for you now? We're adults we have working careers. We're kind of putting our sporting days behind us. And you picked up, two pretty serious injuries. What's it been like for you navigating that? Whilst trying to run a thriving coaching business and live life?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. In both instances, with both injuries, my first thought went to I was actually a bit embarrassed as a coach, because you really want to try and live by example. And a big part of coaching is to make sure you do no harm to your athletes and you educate them on how to stay safe. And so that was where my feelings went. And basically immediately when I did the elbow, I was like, it's pretty funny. They gave me a green whistle to help with the pain, and it was making me think a bit strangely. But my teammate he's wearing a Starr Strength shirt like I was, and apparently I was telling him to take my shirt off, take his shirt off, because I didn't want people to see me getting carried off injured, you know. So that was what the experience was like initially, and then when I did the Achilles, it was also frustrating from that point of view. But then, you know, I worked pretty hard to like try and reframe it for myself and make sure that I was just taking lessons from it, and also being pretty open about it, and sort of owning it, so that I could try and help other people, because obviously other people have injuries, and injuries are a part of sport. Any sport, at anything that involves sort of training hard and you know, intensely, has some kind of injury rate associated with it and risk associated with it. And you know, there shouldn't really be any shame in that. But yeah, I've just been tried to document what I'm going through a little bit online, and you know, it's interesting. People reach out to you and ask questions, and you find that people have gone through similar things, and it's actually been a really in a weird way, it's been quite there's been parts of this that have helped me grow, but I've actually like enjoyed in a funny way, you know. And even just the coming back from it, and getting to do new movements again, getting to be able to do, you know, some lower body work for the first time in ages, and you start to get that excitement for training that actually, you know, as someone who's been training for years and years, you can sometimes lose that a little bit. But I feel like I've got that spark back a bit more in a lot of ways. So that's been good.
Yeah, I think I completely resonate. Even as much as I try to wrap myself in cotton wool these days, I still somehow find myself picking up strange little injuries, new injuries I've never had before, and always weirdly look forward to the process of getting back to 100% and hopefully even more. So yeah, massively resonate with what you're saying about, you know, being able to help others on their own journeys. And I think Instagram's pretty amazing, like you said, for when you share your journey and what you're going through, how many people do reach out and share, you know, things that they've done that they've been successful with, which can help us. But similarly for us to help other people on their own journeys. It's really cool. And I really enjoyed watching you you kind of document and share your journey there. What are some of the biggest lessons or the biggest takeaways that you've had in this process of navigating injury?
Well, specifically, you know, if we talk about the Achilles one itself, like it felt like it kind of came out of nowhere. I've never had any history of any Achilles problems. I've played touch football pretty much my whole life. There wouldn't have ever been like a year gone by that I haven't played some games of touch football and regularly run. But this year was quite different in that way, because I forgot to mention that I've the past sort of 4 years or so, I've been going back and forth between CrossFit training and powerlifting. So I have actually gone and done some powerlifting comps. When I had the elbow injury, I decided to focus on doing powerlifting style training, because it was less dynamic and just rebuild strength. And I had actually just tested 1RMs the day that I did the Achilles, earlier that day, or maybe it was the day before. I tested my 1RMs. I'd just been doing powerlifting for 6 months leading up to that. And I was in a really good place with my training. The elbow was feeling great. I was close to PR numbers on my squat and my deadlift, and I was feeling really strong, and I was ready to just start doing a bit more conditioning and getting into some more GPP. And so I had a situation where my legs were really strong for me at that point in time, but I'd done very little running, so very little activity that involved the lower leg having to absorb impact, change direction, all that kind of stuff. So I felt powerful, I felt fast, and I was feeling good on the touch footy field. And at the 20-minute mark, I just felt the Achilles go. So what I take from that is, and what I'll be taking forward to my coaching is really, you know, even if you've got no history and of this kind of thing, you know, coming back into dynamic running and things like field sports should definitely not be taken lightly. And, you know, go through the process of making sure you're doing some sprint work, doing some change of direction work before jumping into a game like touch footy is pretty important. And it's, you know, it's a classic injury, isn't it? Like that you hear about a lot, especially guys in their 30s, about my age like me. And first game of the season, coming back into it after a rest. So it's pretty frustrating to be one of those guys that's got one of those injuries, but it's also, for the amount of people that I come across and will come across in my career now that I, can work with and advise on this kind of thing. I guess it's a blessing in disguise in that way, that I can help them and hopefully prevent some bad things happening going down the track.
Yeah, no, that's a really good mindset to take with it. Yeah, I mean, we're just getting less and less resilient all the time. That you could probably afford as a youngster to not do any running and just rock up to pre-season. I mean, it's probably what we did every year. I would go through a whole summer and not run at all and just rock up to pre-season to start running every day and be completely fine. But
and I think what tricks you, what fooled me is my capacity and my strength in a lot of ways is no worse than it was, say, 10 years ago, or I'm even sort of stronger in a lot of ways and more, like in certain elements of my fitness. So that fools you into thinking that everything's still firing as it always has. But, there's changes that happen within the connective tissues and things that, a part of the aging process, and even though you have your physical capacity, strength wise and power wise, might be still thereabouts, perhaps in the background there's a bit of aging going on in the ligaments and tendons underneath, which is a scary thought, really. But yeah,
I mean, I know you work with a lot of masters athletes. I know you actually just ran a masters. I think you ran a masters and intermediate camp. Like, has there been any lessons that you've taken out of this? That just re-emphasize previous thoughts, or like giving you new thoughts with regards to how you train masters athletes?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at what they've been doing, like it sounds quite basic, but if you're looking to step things up in your training, whether that's putting more weight on the bar, whether that's coming out of a phase where you haven't done much training and coming into a phase where you want to switch gears and like you've set some goals and you want to get into something, just looking at, okay, what have you been doing? And I know we want to be doing this kind of training and this is where we want to be going. And you may have done that many times before, but let's just make sure we bridge that gap correctly and go through the process of like meeting you where you're training and where your physical ability is now, in terms of what have you done? What have you done over the past couple of months and weeks? Okay, we're only going to move it like a small percentage from there in terms of volume and intensity, and exercise selection, like the complexity of the exercises. So we've got to start with like a rebuilding phase and make sure we do that, go through the process with that. I think that would probably be the biggest kind of overarching thing with this.
And I guess that actually probably doesn't change regardless of whether working with a teenager or a masters athlete. You still want to have that bridging model of programming to get someone to where they want to be.
Yeah, for sure. And I think with some of the teenage, with a younger person, younger adult, you can perhaps get away with a bit more of mistakes with that stuff because they may be a little bit more resilient. But the older athletes, you've got to be even more careful.
Oh, nice. Sorry, before we jumped on this episode, we were talking about kind of just some of our thoughts and philosophies and just things we're thinking about at the moment in regards to training. Something that you mentioned was the concept, and we deal with it a lot in CrossFit, especially, which is a sport we're trying to improve people in all spectrums of fitness, but really the concept of developing strength whilst also developing endurance at the same time. So I know there's lots of different schools of thought on this. There's like the classical periodization model, which talks about, we're going to break up our year into segments where we focus on perhaps an endurance quality, then a strength quality, and then we start to move to more of a conditioning block or a GPP, whereas I think, in CrossFit, it's kind of flipped all of those concepts on the head and said, well, what we can actually train all of them concurrently at the same time. And, there's a lot of people who I follow who are, more in that classical strength and conditioning boat, who still very much believe that's not something that's possible. What their argument would be, you're blunting the the ability to get strong and fit by doing both at the same time. So that's not a good way to do it, whereas we're seeing people, I mean, we just all watched the CrossFit Games, who are adopting that model of training, who are still getting stronger, who are still getting more aerobically conditioned at the highest level, and they've been doing it, their entire lives. So I would love to kind of switch gears a little bit and get into this conversation. I don't really know how we start, but perhaps I just kind of hand it over to you. And, what are your thoughts on that kind of that intro?
Well, yeah. I think you've introduced that concept well. I mean, and this is like, this whole concept is something that I just think about a lot and have always been fascinated about. Because it doesn't seem like, in all the study that I've done and courses that I've been to in my time and coaches that I've spoken to, there's definitely not an agreed upon approach. And of course, this depends on what sport and what the outcome is you're going after, but even within sports that have been around a long time, field sports, for example, like say something like rugby, it's still something that is debated upon about what style of endurance work is going to be most effective and what style of strength work is going to be effective. Those independent of each other, there's enough debate there. But then when you put the blending of the two qualities, it's even more of a sort of grey area and area that's unknown and sort of under researched, really, from what I can see. So, the first thing I'll say is that I don't think I have the answer or anything to this question, but I would like to kind of discuss it with you and talk about maybe some of the things that I've observed and what I've done and some principles that I try and think about when I'm putting programs together and getting people ready for whatever it is they're training for. So we can talk about the training practices, or we can, that's probably, I guess, a good way to start. But
yeah, let's start there.
Some of the main things to think about with training for endurance and strength at the same time, and we'll be using probably mainly examples from within like CrossFit type sport.
Yeah.
Because I think it's most relevant to most of the listeners and our experience as well.
Yeah.
The reason that, well, first of all, I'll start here. It seems that in general, across all sports, strength training can enhance endurance performance for endurance sports, but too much endurance training or endurance training at all can dampen or mute strength gains. So it doesn't work as well the other way. And that's the classical thought on it. There's research there that has shown that points towards a few things that are probably a good rules of thumb to think about when blending strength and endurance training. One of the main ones is considering it may not necessarily be that the two things being trained at once per se is the bad thing. It's the overall training volume and how those sessions are constructed and fit together within the training plan can be the culprit. So it can just be the additive effect of trying to do a strength program plus an endurance program and not considering the overall amount of volume. So that's one of the big considerations is the overall volume. Another thing that apparently, from what some of the research there is that the chronic depletion of glycogen can be another factor as well. So people are doing a lot of endurance work, or not even a lot, but a significant amount of endurance work, but not refueling themselves enough to have enough muscle glycogen. This is with carbohydrates and things like that in their muscle tissues for the muscle tissues to recover, and then the result of that is that the muscle doesn't grow enough to support the strength. So that whether it's through glycogen, chronic glycogen depletion, or whether it's through just a blunting of that hypertrophy effect that you get from strength training, so the muscle growth, the result of that can be less size of muscle, so less cross-sectional muscle area, resulting then in lower strength gains. So considering the overall volume and the glycogen is like two big ones. And then some of the other ones are the RM, the intensity of the strength training. So if you're constantly training to failure or near failure with your strength training, that can be a big thing that sort of causes a lot of interference in the blunting of the strength gains in a concurrent when you're also doing endurance. So that generally blunts strength gains anyway. I think most of us know that we shouldn't be training to failure all the time with our lifts. But when you're training also with endurance, apparently it's particularly bad, basically. And the more you have a concurrent training program, the more you should be staying away from those like maximal intensities with your lifts, and having a few more reps in reserve at the end of the set. And then one other final thing is, and we can kind of circle back and maybe talk about some of these, but
yeah, we will.
Was the time of day and separating strength sessions from endurance sessions within the day. Ideally you won't do it all in one big hit. You'll have those elements separated out by sort of 3 to 5 hours or what have you. And then that way the body apparently can have a better chance of adapting to those, whatever kind of session you put it through. And these are kind of the broader things that some of the research is has talked about in broader strength and conditioning. And some of this stuff might not be as relevant depending on if it's like a more of a CrossFit style program and you actually have to blend this stuff more and more, depending on what kind of how sport specific your training is and how much metcons you're doing with different modes and lengths of time and stuff. So there's like so many moving parts with this stuff. But just to kind of simplify it as much as possible with those like key principles, there's some of the things that go through my mind with it.
I think you did a really good job there at categorizing it into those 4 different categories: volume, chronic depletion of glycogen, and that's just a fuel utilization thing, intensity, the strength training, and then time of day and separation of things. I think, when we look at CrossFit in its most classical form of programming, it's a strength piece followed by a conditioning piece. It's funny, you have an online program, I have an online program as well. And, I very much adhere to the principles of, having a real focus of each training day, whether that be more of a strength bias training focus, more of an aerobic conditioning focus, more of like a speed strength or a strength speed focus, kind of having a general overlying principle of a training day, and really not doing a whole bunch of that blended training. But I guess, even on that conversation, it really depends on who you're working with. Because I think sometimes, people who are pressed for time, may actually still do really well with a blended approach to training, whereby in their training session, they have a combination of strength and conditioning work. But I think, as coaches and as athletes, we're accepting that you can still progress both strength and conditioning by doing that, but it may not be the most efficient way to develop either the two. There are other methods we can use. And I think that's where the conversation always is I often get people saying, I've thrived on this for years and still gotten stronger and conditioning has improved. And it's to say, it's not a good way to do it, but there are other ways that could potentially be even better.
And like any way of training, any program has some kind of trade-off with it, and if
for sure,
potentially if you separate these out and like I've just kind of described and you had it all organized that you were optimizing it for strength gains, might be great. You might get those strength gains and you might actually on a endurance test of whatever kind, say a 10K run, it could be anything, you might score well on those tests independently. But in the sport of CrossFit, at some point you've got to start blending that stuff together because that's what the competitive events look like, or at least some of them or most of them. So where and when and how you blend them together, whether you're doing it all year round or whether you're doing it certain times a year or only certain days of the week is up for anyone. It's like,
I think the more I'm thinking and digesting this now, we could probably sit here and speak for 10 hours about, all the different case scenarios and where you would choose, a different option. And, but let's actually go down that route. Cause I think, okay, people are probably listening to this right now and thinking, okay, well, what do I need to prioritize in my own training? So I think people probably put themselves into different buckets. Am I a really strong, powerful athlete who always struggles with the aerobic side of, let's say, the sport or just aerobic conditioning in general? Conversely to that, you've got someone who, naturally leans towards longer aerobic bouts of training, and they excel in that area and they struggle with the strength component. And then perhaps you have kind of like the balanced athlete in the middle who has
Yeah.
neither as a weakness, but neither necessarily as a strength.
Yes.
So let's take the example of the second example there, which was people who, enjoy the aerobic piece, can be competitive when it's, simple monostructural movements, and perhaps they're moving their own body weight with things like burpees and box jumps and things like that. And that's their strength. And they're struggling with whenever it comes to doing something heavy. What's your approach there when you're looking at from a training standpoint?
My first question, assuming this person wants to compete, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's say this person's their goal
Say,
is,
for example,
they want to be the best physical version of themselves within the sport of CrossFit. And so whether that means competing or just continue seeing that they're improving within the metrics of the sport, we'll use that as our guidelines.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would like to know what kind of time frame we got to work with and where the date is. So let's say they're trying to get ready for the Open or something like that.
Well, let's use that. In fact, because this is the great time, Starry, given that we're about 15 weeks out now.
15 weeks out,
and
yeah,
everyone's
it's great.
starting to think about the Open. I mean, we had a little laugh about it on a post I made the other day. It's that like famous 16-week mark is typically like when every program starts to kind of switch the gears towards the Open. Let's use a CrossFit Open as our kind of like framework for this conversation.
Yeah, fully. Okay. So with someone who is a bit more in the essence of endurance kind of athlete that needs to try and really work their strength development, at this time of year, there's still, I would say, strength training, like classical kind of strength training, is probably still taking up about 80% of their training. But we're about to start changing that, and once we get to about 8 weeks out from the Open, their program would look quite general and quite specific, and not a whole lot different to the other athlete we were describing. There would be some subtle differences, and it depends what lifts they're weak at, and we have to still target specific lifts and things. But for the most part, the training would look quite similar for a lot of my athletes from about the 8-week mark out from the Open. And so the 12 to 8 week mark is like the stepping stone from more strength focus to the more sports specific focus. This is for me. This is what I would do with that athlete. So to give you like a bit of more of an in-depth example, like they might be strength training 5 days a week, and on 2 of those days at the moment, they might do conditioning and as well. And those conditioning, depending what the athlete needed, would be maybe one of them would be a like sports specific, like just a CrossFit style metcon of some kind that was suited to what they needed. And the other one may be similar to that, or it may be some monostructural, like cyclical intervals, depending what they needed with that. But 2 to 3 pieces of conditioning for that person as an additional to their main strength program would kind of be what that would look like for someone like that. For me, I don't know.
I would agree. I think it's really important, especially the example earlier about the time of day when you're training, is to really make sure you're splitting those sessions up. So having days where you're really just focusing and driving up as much tension, strength, all the things that athlete needs, and then having a day where perhaps even on those sessions where you're blending both the conditioning and strength work, the strength work even on that day, maybe more, like higher volume, less intense strength work. Maybe it's more like structural balance focused, where you're not asking someone to go from like a really heavy triple where they're like trying to be as sympathetic as possible and as fired up, to then suddenly doing long, slow, cyclical intervals, two very different ends of the spectrum there. So I think even within strength work, we can define it even further, right? Because
for sure,
even within strength work, we've got so many different categories. You've got strength repeatability, you've got absolute strength, you've got strength speed, which is like your Olympic lifting. You've got like bodybuilding stuff, which still kind of sits into the category of like weight training. And then like even within conditioning, we've got that like really slow, 60 minutes of conversation pace versus like Fran, which is, like the mixed modal all out hard out piece. So I think even within there, you've got categories as well.
Oh, 100%. And that's where it's so, so many moving parts to this sport, which is like, I think best practices and like as a community of coaches and athletes, we're getting each season, each year, we're getting a little bit better at how we're arranging this stuff and, the things that we can take from broader strength and conditioning and other sports. But then some of the things are just like, when you understand this sport and how it works and the fact that the competitive events are constantly changing every year anyway.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, there's definitely an art to it. And there's a lot of educated guessing going on a lot of the time with how to put it together.
Yeah, I think that's right though. Educated guessing is really all we're doing. We don't really know the answers. And I know you're exactly the same. Like you've probably done something that's worked for half your people and just hasn't worked at all for the other half. And
that's
like
right.
just trying to find out what works for each person is super important.
That's right. Yeah, for sure. And just being able to exchange feedback with the athlete as much as you can and taking those notes, taking the lessons. I'm actually, a bit of a side note here, but I used to be more opposed to athletes competing regularly. I thought it was quite taxing for them to do it. And I used to hold them back from doing it as much and just focusing more on like the major comp in the year or 2 comps in the year. And in recent years, I've become a little bit more open to them competing in minor events a little bit more frequently or putting themselves in environments where they've got that little bit of competitive feel, maybe with other athletes and things because of that feedback, the necessity for that feedback to know where they're at.
Yeah, totally agree.
Because the tests are evolving and things are changing so much and they're realistically, their training is quite chaotic for portions of the year. And to get a grasp on where they're at and how they're moving against other athletes is quite valuable. I think athletes always come away with lessons from competing, obviously within reason, and you don't want to be pumping them with comps all the time, but and they come at a cost for recovery wise and disruption of training and all that. But there's also a lot of valuable info that comes from them.
I mean, I completely agree on that. I think there is a skill in competing that can only be improved on by competing.
That's true as well.
I think like a lot of people in that training environment all the time where they're either by themselves or, they're following sets and reps or strict intervals on aerobic work. And there's just a difference. Even if you're someone who says you can go hard and make yourself hurt, the level of intensity people bring to an online qualifier or the CrossFit Open, you just don't see that in your normal training schedule. Now, there are some people who can. I'm definitely not one of those people. But like I think people really reserve that like 110% effort for times when it really matters, and that's competition time. So I completely agree. I think a lot of us never really know what we're actually capable of until we're put into that arena where you're competing for something. Even if it's your own pride and just to see what you can do. And I do think that when you pull people out, and I've made that mistake as a coach in the past, focus too much on the priority of an athlete, where you're just working on, the quote unquote weaknesses all the time. And you make the call to not compete for a year. And then even though you see, all their weaknesses slowly start to turn to strengths in the training environment, they just lost that skill to be able to compete on a weekend, which means like, knowing how to warm up, knowing how to cool down, knowing how to race other people, what it's like when you're leading a race versus what it's like when you're at the back of a pack and how that affects you psychologically. There's just so many skills that you just can't ever replicate, in the training environment without doing it.
For sure. And just all the skills within the competition and also just the mental resilience of it and having been exposed to it more and more regularly and realize, it just makes the athlete a bit more, less stressed out by the event mentally, and then able to actually perform better if they're more accustomed to it. Whereas if it's something that they've been building up to and they haven't had any other exposure to it, it's a lot for the system to take on.
For sure. Yeah. And I think that's probably where we see a lot of people not actually perform at their fullest potential because they're letting the stresses of the competition environment actually take over.
Or if they've had a great competition or a bad competition and then the hangover of that stays with them, and then they get a shock at the next one, because either a good shock or a bad shock, because it's too far between these events. Whereas I'm kind of thinking and comparing it in my mind to rugby, where you've got a season of games and you've got to show up every Saturday and play the game. And some Saturdays you lose, some Saturdays you win. And, that process of dealing with that outcome and getting ready, getting up for the next week, I think is a skill that field sports athletes get to enjoy a bit more. And athletes that come from more of an individual sport background that doesn't have as many a high frequency of competitive events in the year, it's sometimes be a bit more challenging for them.
Yeah, for sure. I think the concept of not riding your highs and riding your lows for too long, like enjoying it in the moment, or, being upset in the moment and then being able to just draw a line and just move on to the next job. And I do think that's an interesting thing. I think a lot when it comes to CrossFit is that a lot of us, especially now, people who are probably competing in late 20s, in their 30s, or maybe they're in the masters categories. There's a lot of people in the world who this is their first sport. Like sport wasn't a part of their childhood.
Yes.
And they walked into CrossFit gym for the first time in their late 20s or early 30s. Yeah. And because they had maybe natural ability, or they worked really hard at it, and now like an athlete where they're going to competitions and competing. Yeah. And if you haven't had an opportunity to to develop that craft of competing throughout sport as a kid, like perhaps myself and yourself did, there's just so many learnings that have to take place there, and like you're having to work it all out as a adult, which overthinks everything, whereas as a kid you just do it and you just learn.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think about that all the time, because I see really talented people out there, or even people at the CrossFit Games, who continually don't perform based on the physical capacity that they have when it comes to the actual competition. And then when you dig a little bit deeper and you look into their training history and their sporting history, like CrossFit was their first sport that they ever did.
For sure.
As a 20-year-old. Super
interesting. And it's no surprise, like if that's the case, is it? Like, and then just going back to that, what we're talking about with, obviously there's a happy medium with the frequency of competing somewhere, and it'll be different for different athletes, but getting that exposure to it, in not overexposure and not underexposure to the comps is important. We've been, this year in terms of comps, just speaking of that, there's been none happening really. So we've got a lot of guys just itching to do it. Keeping people motivated to keep training without the. It's important. I believe that you want to be able to find enjoyment in your training without the need to have a comp to prepare for. That's I believe that's important. But I've always over the past few years been working with guys getting ready for things like comps, and so to have not many on the calendar this year has been a bit of a challenge. To keep people engaged and have that fire. This CrossFit type training can be pretty intense, pretty challenging mentally to push yourself in, and if there isn't some kind of event coming up, sometimes that's hard for the guys to find that motivation sometimes.
Yeah, and I totally get that as well. As much as I say, and you say, it's important to find fulfillment in the process and the journey. When you have a deadline, it just gives you focus, something to focus on. The end is in sight. Like you prepping for your powerlifting competitions, probably like, you just had this extra level of intent and focus with every training session you did, probably leading up to it.
Yeah.
I think it's really normal for our motivation to kind of like go in these waves all year between like, just being disciplined and getting the job done, not really having too many expectations with the outcome, versus like really, going full into a training session and having expectations and setting goals.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we talked a lot about this weak athlete who is, probably more suited towards aerobic conditioning, which is basically me, let's be honest. And, one thing I do hear a lot from these people is, the need to want to do conditioning when they see that all they have is strength work. And I think that it's a number of things. Number one, it's they start to lose, I guess one is awareness, but a trust in their actual ability to do let's say CrossFit, like the CrossFit Open. I haven't done a Metcon, coach, in 3 months. How am I possibly going to do the CrossFit Open? Or the feeling like they haven't worked hard enough. I think that's something we probably deal with a lot, especially in probably newer clients. That you finish your A, B, C, D strength work and you're like, well, that doesn't feel like a Metcon, and it will never feel like a Metcon because it's not Metcon. So I think, what's some of your strategies in terms of, speaking to those people? And I guess it's always going to come down to education, but how do you get that message across to them?
For these guys, so you're talking about for the ones that you're trying to give them less conditioning work because they don't need it as much, those guys. So I like to try and demonstrate, should be a bit clever with the programming, so that we're giving them evidence that they've still got it. They've still got their, whatever it is, like their capacity. And I'm checking, I want to check that too. So, I'll give them conditioning. We'll still have some conditioning pieces in their training, and some of those conditioning pieces are actually tests in a way. I'm not necessarily saying this is a test to them. But I'm looking at the data. I'm looking at what the numbers or the times they're able to get in the workout or the score they're able to get in the workout, and we're comparing that to either times they've done before in the past, when we knew there was, we want them within. We can feel confident in the program if they're still within a certain time or score for that workout, or comparing them to where other athletes are that on those workouts currently. Whether that's data from within my own programs with athletes, or within other competitive events, leaderboards and things on other that are going on around the place. And that's not the only. I mean, that's not to say that you wouldn't put them through all these tests and give them make that like the main thing all the time, but dropping that stuff in there just as little, just to check is one thing I'll be doing with them. And that just gives them peace of mind that it's okay, like, to put some of that hard conditioning aside for now, because we're focusing on the strength increases. And yes, don't worry, you've still got that capacity there. And if it feels like it's dropping down, it depends on the time and how far we're out from competition as well. Like, we're okay with you not feeling that fit at the moment because we're 20 weeks out, but as we get closer, they're obviously going to be more apprehensive about that. And it's okay. We keep checking it as we go through.
I think it's also important to remember with this client that we're talking about, like, they're going to probably be able to adapt very quickly back to a more conditioning biased program because it's their strength. Right. It's what they're ingrained to be good at. So they can afford to step away from it for longer, still come back in it, and, probably get back to where they left off pretty quickly. Yeah. All right, let's flip it to the other end of the spectrum now, because I find this client very interesting because it's the total opposite of what I am. I feel like you might be more towards this end, Starry. This is like the very strong. I think strong and powerful are almost two different categories in themselves, but this is a person who's innately very strong. Lifting weights is something that comes naturally to them. They don't need to jack themselves up too much for it. And conditioning is where they struggle. So, typically, like, anything within, I guess, the 1 to 5 minute time domain in conditioning is probably going to be something they're very excited about. But as soon as you get towards your classic open test where you're getting probably like 8 or more minutes, it's probably the type of workout where they look at and think, oh, this is just not something I really want to be doing. So let's talk about training and, this blending of strength and conditioning training for that type of athlete. So, their numbers with squatting, deadlifting, absolute strength movements are like high. They're in the top 5%. Their Olympic lifting numbers are high relative to their field of competition. What's your approach?
Yeah, so with these guys, they need to be, first of all, they need to be doing more endurance work, more conditioning work, different energy systems. We'll keep it simple. The type of, and also they need to retain their strength, the strength that they do have, because that's, you got to weigh things up and you consider what a leaderboard will do. If we really want to get into like the best competitive outcome, we want to know that those things that have kept them at that level that they're at currently, they might be leaning still pretty heavily on those strength qualities. So you've got to have some numbers in mind that you want to be able to make sure we can maintain as minimums. for their strength. But assuming that they're looking, you never really want to let them get weaker. Sometimes you have to if you've really got to push some other qualities. But let's say they're trying to maintain the extra endurance work. We're not just throwing on more and more like metcons and hard mixed modal work, because if we do that, it's going to sort of burn them out. They're going to, there's all sorts of things that can happen, but basically leads to overtraining or too much stress on the joints or whatever. So a lot of that extra endurance volume can be spent in the lower intensity end of the spectrum on activities that are lower eccentric load and lower impact on the joints. So we're talking about like the classic cyclical modes of like rowing, cycling, maybe some ski and some running and swimming, things like that. Now, I'm not saying that they need to just be doing hours and hours of that stuff and that's what will enhance their performance and have the result, but there definitely should be some of that in there. And getting clever about having a high amount of endurance work that is that lower impact style, but then still getting a good blend of some mixed modal work, enough to improve them in the sport. And that amount of mixed modal work may increase a little bit more as they get closer to the comp side of things, whereas the further out we are, I would probably, I think of it as like separating the different exercises and modes out. The further out we are from training, and it's a bit like a sort of a funnel. As we get towards a competitive event, we start to mix the modes a little bit more. That's kind of my approach with that.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's
those guys.
I think some common characteristics or traits that we see from these people, the really powerful guys and girls, typically are people who go out way too hot in workouts. Have this tendency, even in a long workout, to just not really know where their thresholds sit and where their capacity sits. And you're very typical, like bad paces is probably what we'd refer to them as. Go out way too fast, and then just, performance drops off a cliff at the halfway mark.
For sure.
And then, they struggle through the session, through the workout. That's on a competition standpoint, but it's also, you see that a lot, even on the training environment. And I think, like you said, it's really important with these people, knowing that like really high intensity training, especially high intensity aerobic conditioning, is very taxing on the nervous system, takes a lot of time and resources to recover from. You got to be really careful with those type of people as to how much of that high intensity conditioning work you're giving them. For them, heavy strength training might not actually be that taxing on the nervous system. It's something that comes naturally to them. They can kind of step in and hit some fairly heavy weights. You do probably have to be wary about their skeletal systems, like their ligaments and their joints and stuff. If they're able to put really heavy loads in them all the time, sometimes as a smart coach, you just got to pull them back a little bit deliberately, so they're not just going to their 90-95% all the time, because that could have other issues, like dislocating an elbow.
For sure.
But you gotta, I think with those guys, something I always think about is trying to, and obviously it depends just how powerful they are and how much further behind their conditioning is, but actually trying to dampen those people, deliberately trying to make them, and they don't like hearing this because they all pride themselves on their strength, but like almost want to make you a little bit weaker in a sense. And I want you to start to feel and recognize where your capacities and thresholds sit. So I certainly know from a training standpoint, when it comes to prescription of cyclical modalities, so like, your rowing workouts or assault bike workouts, have to be a lot more detailed in what I'm looking to get out of the training session. Because I think if you just write 1K row, rest 3 minutes times 3, you're going to probably see a blistering, world record pace the first K, and then, a considerable drop off. Whereas you give 3 sets of 1K row to an aerobic athlete, they're probably going to hit their pacing pretty much on point and walk away from the session feeling pretty good. You give it to the strong athlete, and that ends up being the hardest session in the week, and they end up needing 2-3 days to recover from it. So I really think that's an interesting case study to work with.
Yeah, it is, and you're 100% right. The how it's carried out by those guys is really important, because it's so easy for them to tap into their strength and be powerful, even when and this is why that they're always not pacing workouts enough and going out too hard. even when they feel like they're pulling back and going easy, they need to be dialing back even more. But it's hard for them because they're good at producing power and force. Plus, in terms of their energy systems, they've got and haven't got much to play with. So it's once they get a bit lactic, it's like it's all over, and it's easy for that to happen. And yeah, I think interval, like setting up sessions where they need to have repeatability of intervals or splits is good practice for those guys.
Yeah.
Just the skill of that itself and fine tuning that, and maybe repeating a piece for a few weeks and trying to get better at getting it more consistent is something that you could play around with them, I think.
Yeah, I love the concept of repeatability, and I think with strong athletes, always something in the language that we use is like, the easiest way to understand repeatability, if you're doing repeated intervals, is your time should be finishing at pretty much the same point every time, right?
Yeah.
So give or take 5 seconds, adjust your pace so that you're able to finish each interval at the same time. That seems quite straightforward. Now, what I find really interesting, which often we don't see when we're just as coaches working with athletes online, we're just looking at numbers. We could read, okay, took me 3.5 minutes to do interval 1, 3.5 for interval 2, 3.5 for interval 3. All right, great. Well, you were sustainable and repeatable. I think you nailed the objective of the session. When you watch these athletes, it's really different. The way that they approach pacing is still moving really fast for short periods of time, and then like stopping.
They don't. In the 3.5 minutes.
Within the 3.5 minutes.
Yeah.
They don't
it's not
have
uniform.
They don't have that ability to modulate their tempo and their cadence as well as more of an aerobic athlete does, which I find really funny. So it's like their pacing is about, well, I only have one speed at which I can do every movement, which is probably
so
pretty damn
turn
fast.
It on and off.
Yeah, I'm going to hit it really fast. Okay, well, you told me to pace, so I'm going to stop here. I'm going to break my wall balls and then I'm going to start again. So I think when you look at the breathing cadence or the heart rate cadence of those athletes, it's like it drives up really, really high and then it drops and then it drives and it drops. And I think that's really interesting because whilst they're still nailing the stimulus of the session, which is trying to be repeatable, they're still not doing it in the most efficient way possible. And I always find it quite hard to get that narrative across to say, we would much rather be doing it 3 minutes, 30 intervals, but we want that heart rate and that breathing rate to more or less just be steadily climbing throughout the entire 3.5 minutes by playing with things like adjusting the way that we move or the speed of contractions.
Yeah. The speed of contractions, and even just these guys they're good at switching on tension in their body. That's why they're strong. So, trying to inhibit that and bring awareness to as little tension as you need, only the amount of tension that you need to do that wall ball and no more kind of thing. Because that affects the blood pressure and the heart rate and everything as well.
Let's talk about that real quick. Cause I think I love that you brought that up. Cause I think about that all the time. The concept of using just enough to do the movement or to do the rep, elaborate on that and then I'll pitch in.
Wow. This is something, I feel like we're talking about me here, about something I need to work on because this was never a strength of mine, was, making sure that you're only every single repetition, if you're putting in an extra 3% effort on more than you need to on every repetition, that's going to add up a lot in a workout that's got 300 reps or something like that, obviously. So it's any extra muscular tension or power that's being expressed, that's just being bled as excess. I think there's a lot of scope for, there's the obvious things like don't do your pull-ups any higher than you need to get the chin over the bar and things like that.
Don't squat any deeper than you need to. That's why I always just hit parallel.
Yeah, exactly. So there's some obvious ones there. But you can even watch, if you really watch the good games athletes and how much effort is in the top of their thruster, for example, or if you see it done poorly, you see guys almost having to just like stop the bar at the top of their thruster. But even the degree to which the muscles are being kind of squeezed and switched on, and what the breathing's doing relative to that. So often the breathing's being inhibited by extra muscular tension when it doesn't need to be. as
Yeah,
well.
and I think it can literally be applied to pretty much every movement you can think of. I think
Yeah,
even
yeah,
something as simple as a burpee, you watch powerful guys and girls, they're like, their chest is on the floor for a millisecond before they've like exploded up and basically done like a clapping push-up back to their feet.
yeah, yeah,
Whereas you watch, sometimes it serves to actually watch weak athletes perform movements. And you just see how much they have to leverage efficiency because
yeah.
they don't have the strength to do it. And actually, what's just reminded me of this is so I've just started surf skiing, which I think is pretty big in Oz. It's
Yeah,
basically
yeah.
like you're in a really thin kayak. It's super wobbly. And it's like all about using your hip flexors and legs. You're driving into the paddle. So I've been doing this probably for a few months now.
Oh
And,
yeah,
I'm obviously like gym training is the main form of physical activity I do these days. And
yeah,
so I get into this thing and all I immediately start thinking about is, all right, well, I'm sure I'm stronger than everyone else here surf skiing. I'm at a unique advantage already. And I think for the first 2 months, even still now, just like continuously doing way too much work.
oh
And it's
yeah, yeah,
been a really funny like journey being back in like the learning shoes, having a coach tell me what to do, and constantly saying do less, do less, do
yeah,
less, and
yeah,
finally like trying to. So for the first time in my life, I've actually been the strong athlete trying to become weaker and more efficient. Which I massively resonate because I have a lot of clients who do sit on that end of the spectrum. But you're right, and it's about finding that how much, just the sweet spot as to how much you need to actually put in to perform each repetition well. And if it's in CrossFit, to the standards of the movement, and
yeah,
any
yeah.
extra efficiency, is just taken away from your ability to perform later in the workout.
Oh, for sure. Like, like that example you gave of the paddleboarding, like any water activity, it's just magnified. It's like a huge example of it. Like
Mm.
I've been to, I was getting some swimming, going to this swimming course like last year, I think it was, and they were doing video like in front of the group. They were filming us underwater, and then you're getting feedback in front of the group later on in the classroom about your swimming stroke. And I was just like the laughing stock of this course because all these swimmers are just laughing at me trying to push myself through the water or push the water past me or whatever it is, but I'm just doing it completely wrong, very inefficiently. And we've got the eye for it, I guess, a little bit with our sport, but it's magnified a lot more and stuff like swimming where you've got to be aerodynamic and all that kind
Yeah.
of stuff as well.
And I think for people listening to this who perhaps like go to a CrossFit gym or they do classes, or they don't put too much thought into their training, I think it's naturally probably the next level that you go to when you're on the journey of learning new movements. I think the first thing that we do is we just want to tick the boxes and make sure we can perform the movement according to the movement standards.
Yeah, hit
But
the
then a lot of
positions.
hit the positions and make sure it looks like the YouTube video the coach is that's telling you to do it. But then a
Yeah,
lot of people get stuck there and they don't move on from there.
yeah,
So they simply think they have this kind of checkbox mentality. Well, I can do the movement. I can do a double under. Why do I need to
yeah,
spend any more time,
yeah. It's like
improving the
done.
movement?
It's done. I've
Exactly.
got
And
it. Yeah,
I think the next progression is like thinking about things like breathing and tension, and understanding that the level of tension needed for a wall ball depends on the amount of reps that you're having to do, and the combinations of movements that it's going with, what you have before it, what you have after it. And
yeah,
similarly, like I think with weightlifting, which is something that I've found hard because I didn't really do snatching or anything like that in as a rugby player, is
yeah,
understanding that every extra kilogram you're putting onto a bar is requiring just that extra 1% in tension and drive that's needed to perform it. But how many people do you see early, with a light thrust on the bar, who are like literally throwing that bar into the ceiling like they're trying to launch a 10 foot in the air from rep one,
yeah,
and so starting to get people to think about, well, look, do just enough to execute the rep is super important.
yeah, fully.
Okay, cool. Now, question with this athlete, the strong athlete, do they have more of a case to be successful with blended training than the athlete who is weaker but more conditioned? What are your thoughts on that? So for example, what I mean by that is, can they actually benefit more from doing a strength and conditioning session blended into the same session than the athlete who is weaker but more conditioned?
Ah, I don't know about that. It's just like, it's the classic, like, it depends kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, I know, if they've done a hard strength session and the load, if they've done a strength session and then they go into finish their strength, then go into their conditioning, the stronger athlete, especially if it's been things like deadlifts or squats with a large absolute load, they should be more taxed and therefore not perform as well and get as much power output and quality in the intensity of their conditioning session. If it's like a hard, intense effort that they need to produce, they probably won't be at their best going into that. I have seen that. That's one example of something I've seen.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're getting at in terms of
yeah.
like, yeah.
I mean, I think the general concept here is that whenever, I think maybe we have to define like why the classic school of thought says that you shouldn't do the two together. Is that, do you want to try, go ahead and try and define that?
Well, I think in a perfect world they're separated, but practically and logistically in most of the time, in most settings, they need to be done either together or like what I'm saying is a lot of sports teams, a lot of athletes, whether they're, especially if they're just like recreational level, they're not able to do like 2 sessions in a day, and they've got to do it at once. And you can still make improvements in both these things. I'm not trying to say is that you can't train these things together and still get better in both. You can. It just may not be quite as optimal, especially if you're at a higher level and you're really trying to push both of them and get the most out of your training, and you're training quite high volumes. It may get pretty important to separate them out in that case. But I still think for the majority of the people and a majority of context, it's like A, it's necessarily from a just logistic point of view, and B, you can still make quite a lot of improvements for either of those type athletes by still having them like mixed in the sessions.
Yeah. I think the way I try to always describe it is that, I like to use the concept of adaptation credit. So if we got 100 points to use in a day, and adaptation credits means like, you're putting your points towards something that you're trying to get better at. If you got a session that has both strength and conditioning, you can only put 50 points towards your strength and you got 50 points left for your conditioning work. What we're trying to talk about here is, well, hey, if you split your sessions, you can put 100 points towards developing and adapting in strength. And just look how much more you can improve strength by. And I think when I try to use that analogy, it kind of makes a little bit more sense, because you can't have everything. We don't have infinite levels of adaptation credits, so we can just throw wherever the hell we want. And I think on top of that, work, stress, life, nutrition, relationships, those are all taken away from adaptation credits as well. Training isn't just the only thing that's using these adaptation credits. We have life that's happening, and we have a 24-hour day. For most of us, we've got 1 hour, 2 hours to train in a day. Those other 22 to 23 hours are taken away from your ability to really use whatever resources left. And often it's just whatever we have left is what we use for our training. And I think especially if you're someone who trains at nighttime, well, then it's pretty simple. If you've had a big old day and it's been stressful, like, you're going to have not much left to finish your day. And therefore you've got to be probably even smarter about self-regulating and making adjustments, which, when I had Alethea on the podcast, she said that you guys do really, really well. It's just constant fine tuning of, well, what do you have today? And, listen to what you have and give it what you need. And whereas if you're someone who starts your day at the start, well, then you're actually kind of prioritizing your training over everything else in your day. Okay, you sleep will factor in, but you've basically got the fresh new day, how much you want to put towards your training. And if you make that decision to throw all 100 credits towards your training, well, you've probably not got much left for work, relationships, your social life. And you just have to bear that in mind, because if you ignore that, then, you're going to have a miserable rest of the day.
Yeah, they all impact each other. And talking about, going back to the example of an athlete who needs to put some extra time in, or, needs to work on their endurance capacity. Sometimes that can be the more time consuming thing, because aerobic work it's sustainable work. It needs to be like longer sessions.
You need more time to do your session. Yeah.
And you literally need more time to do it. And that can be the roadblock for a lot of these guys if they're busy. It's not that they're not motivated to do it. They just literally run out of, it's hard to find the time, because they might say to me, I want to do some extra aerobic work. And I'll say, okay, well, we're already doing a pretty big session in the evenings. We could probably do some stuff here, but they go, what if I come in the morning and do some more? I go, well, in theory, that would probably be beneficial. A low intensity aerobic session in the morning, for example, might be a good thing. But in order for you to do that, what time are you going to go up in the morning? And they'll be like, oh, probably like 4 o'clock. And I'm like, well, it's not, I'll take the sleep, and that's, I'll take the sleep, and we'll have to take the kid on the conditioning a little bit, maybe, because otherwise you're going to be too tired. And so you're weighing things up like that, obviously. Like,
yeah. And I think just, whenever you're going to add a session, like something has to change. You can't just keep on adding volume and not change anything else. It's either, if you're putting something else, and something else has got to go to keep you balanced and making sure that, you actually do have those credits available.
Yeah, that's right. Another thing that just sort of came to mind as well, I didn't mention before, is like there's a sort of like this theoretical model that I'd read somewhere about interference between, and they say that you want to avoid training for you've got central training and peripheral training. So for strength work, your central training is your CNS workload. So it's your high load, your heavy weights, and it's training more the CNS. And your peripheral training is when you're training the muscles more, and you're trying to do bodybuilding and things like that, and higher reps to get like a hypertrophy response. So you've got central and peripheral. And then for endurance training, you've got central and peripheral types of training as well. Like the peripheral in the muscles is more the lactic type training, the stuff that gets the muscles burning. And then you've got the central, which is like the heart and lungs working. And something to consider is not trying to do peripheral training for strength and conditioning work at the same time in the same session, if that makes sense. So
yeah.
A bad example of doing that would be 5 sets of 10 back squats, but then you're doing prowler efforts afterwards for your conditioning. Yeah. So both those things are targeting in the muscle kind of effects, peripheral adaptations. So what would complement a session that is involving more hypertrophy weight ranges, so rep ranges. So let's say you're doing that 5x10 back squats, you'd be better off doing something that was more just heart and lungs and lower intensity continuous aerobic works more in the aerobic end of the spectrum. It's the centralized adaptations that you're chasing. And then conversely, if you were doing sets of smaller sets of reps, 3s and 5s on your strength work, then that might be a session where you can go a bit more lactic on your conditioning work. Or maybe not in the same session, but in that week or in that phase of training, or in that, that day somewhere.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's like, how can we simplify that to the listener who's like heard the word central and peripheral being like, okay, massive overload here. But I think, it's like, well, I think you can kind of put yourself into the shoes of when you're about to do a really heavy set of back squats, what are the feelings that are associated with it? Like, okay, like probably elevated breathing, like there's a need to create tension before, probably like a shortness of breath, and like moving towards more stress related breathing because you're getting fired up, like, you're taking short, fast inhalations. And I think, if you're about to push a prowler, which if we're putting that in the endurance category, as fast as you can for a short period, you're probably going to all have those similar feelings. Whereas if you're prepping to do a set of 10 reps on a bench press and 3 to 4 sets, you're not necessarily having to get that jacked up for it. You can probably have a fairly low heart rate, breathing still in your belly, not have the need to get all fired up and jacked up to do it. And similarly, if you're going to do a long row at just an easy, sustainable pace, you probably also wouldn't have to put yourself into that I guess that frame of mind as well. So that's probably maybe an easier way, unless you can think of another way to try and explain it.
There's a couple of words getting thrown around that are probably a bit bit of jargon, but basically what I was trying to say is, if your strength work is targeting the muscles and getting, you're doing high repetition strength work where it's getting like a burning effect in the muscle or like a bit of a pump in the muscle. That's strength work that's getting that muscular effect. You wouldn't want to do endurance work, ideally in that session, that is getting that same kind of muscle pump effect, but from that lactic burn, that you get, so 30-second repeats on the air bike wouldn't go well with like the high rep back squats.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, that's a good way
so
to put it.
If it's really in the muscle and fatiguing where you can feel that burn or that blood pump in the muscle, don't do strength and endurance work in the same session that are having that kind of effect. That's probably the main thing I was trying to get across there.
Yeah. Okay, good. You explained that well.
Yeah,
okay,
sorry,
let's finish us off, Starry, by talking about the balance athlete. So, our conversation is still on the idea of blending strength conditioning. I think we've talked a lot about all the principles already, things you need to be aware of, things need to be things that you can implement in your training to be successful on both. Is there any special exceptions or things that are different when it comes to the balance athlete who is good at both strength and endurance work?
Well, I think it's probably the easier athlete to work with because there's not as, don't have to have too much of a bias in any direction. So it's easier to mix modes and still get a response. And, you don't have to, you can just kind of look to build general capacity across the board, and mixing things can be pretty, good for this athlete, like a lot of the time. I still think they should go through phases of the year where they're separating their training modes out and working them independently and working towards the more blended specific work. But fortunately, they'll have less of a need to have to pick, at where they're going to put and they won't have the stress as much of having to be like, I've really got to play this game where I'm working this endurance side of things, or I'm working this strength side of things, and having to like leave that other side of it aside, which could be pretty stressful and hard to get right. So I think it's definitely like the easier one of the three, to be honest. Would you agree with that yourself? Or?
Yeah, I mean, massively. I mean, these are people, if you are a balanced athlete, you're very much more suited to the sport of CrossFit than anyone else, which is already, makes life a lot easier for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're talking like balanced in terms of just like strength versus endurance, then I would be looking at, you've also got to look a skill set to consider, and what's their skill set like, and is there a particular movement or pattern that they have a deficit in, or where's the weak areas with that? Because something we haven't spoken a lot about is skills and movement side of things, which is you could argue is even more important, because it's like the biomechanical efficiency of the movements themselves can, like if someone moves beautifully, they may not have the biggest VO2 max, but they won't need it because they're moving so well and so efficiently. And that person, and movement often will trump physiological capacity a lot of the time. I think, from what
I completely agree. In fact, we started talking about it. We started talking about the checkbox mentality of people start by just wanting to achieve the movement. Is my start position right? Is my finish position right? Do I get the rep? Yes. Okay, move on. But then, then we started talking about improving, I guess, efficiency and tension and breathing. But I think you're completely right. The more efficiently you can perform a repetition, which technically means the less energy you're expending per rep, is so important. I think it's, one of actually the biggest things I've started to look for, when it comes to, I guess, like scouting for talent in the future. When someone comes as an athlete who has a lofty goal, like getting to CrossFit Games, seeing how someone moves, and it doesn't necessarily have to be movement within the movements of the sport, but just, how they naturally move, how they put their arms over their head, how they flow into a squat and a hinge and a pistol, and all these things is such a good precursor for knowing, what that potential for an athlete is. Now, obviously movement can be like changed and honed and trained, but I think a lot of us have this like natural, level of movement. Like you look at Matt Fraser and he just moves so effortlessly with everything. It's funny. I always think about, when I think back to like probably when we were at regionals, you would watch pretty much all the heats, maybe bar the top heat, and there'd be sloppy movement everywhere. Like ugly looking Olympic lifts, poor positions, people just muscling their way through things, like you put set muscle ups in there and like people are chicken winging, feet are like, way apart. Whereas now, even the last few games before this year, the games where you had, 4 or 5 heats at the games, like even at regionals in the last year regionals, right
It's
down to the bottom heat, like you just don't see sloppy movement anymore. It's so rare to see someone like have a tight position and still get to the top of the sport.
Yes.
And I think that's
100%.
been cool to see, that you just can't get away with it anymore. Like even like, unless you're obscenely strong, that your levels are just way above even the best in the sport, that you can get away with some discrepancies in movement. Just doesn't happen.
Yeah, for sure. And like, so what we were saying, like we were saying before, if you're trying to weigh up where you want to invest your time, your training time, in, do we want to build the horsepower, or can we, and in building that horsepower or that engine, let's say we can move the needle 3% on it, but if we can tidy up our skills on these 5 different skills that you could fix up and move a bit better on, that improvement in overall performance on the leaderboard with tidying up those skills is going to be a lot bigger than that small little improvement in capacity, if you can get it.
Yeah, I mean, like I think even you just said 2 things. You said skills, and then like movement is almost a separate category as well. I mean, I've seen it so many times where someone has plateaued on a front squat or a back squat, and you look at their positions and like they're far from optimal. Maybe like knees are caving in, hips are shooting back, chest is falling forward, and a dedicated training phase of just improving that position. Getting their torso to sit 10 degrees more upright.
Yeah,
It'd be like 20 kilograms on a squat.
Yeah, it's huge.
And, they haven't improved. They haven't done strength training. They haven't been just putting more weights in the bar trying to get it. It was just a simple position of leverage has now allowed them to put, 10% more on a squat.
Yeah, those things are huge, because you've not only like made that improvement in that squat, you've probably got carryover in that pattern now to your wall balls and your thrusters and everything as well. But you've done it at a very little expense of like fatigue in your training, because if it's a skill based thing, what I'm saying is it doesn't require as much impact on the body and recover from. So you can, it's a really efficient way of improving your efficiency, basically, because you're not expending as much energy, you're just actually learning skills, rather than pouring on more and more just conditioning reps or weight on the bar and reps in your training. So
yeah, and I mean, I know every coach always says it, and CrossFit Level 1 teaches us all the time, but the importance of prioritizing mechanics and efficiency over load. But we all still forget. We all get wrapped up in the ego race of wanting to put more weight on our bars, or whatever it is that we just, we have to be pulled back. And often for me, injury for me is always a good reminder to go back to where I can eke improvements out on movement. For me has always been, I don't know, just a massive light bulb moment.
Yeah, 100%. I can't agree more with that. I'm still learning too. Don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, I think unless you're blessed to be a fantastic mover naturally, or you just worked really hard at it at a young age, it could be something that is forever going to be a priority, because there's always improvements in positions and technique and efficiency that can be made. So, I always have a bit of frustration when someone says they feel like they've done everything and they can't get better at the sport anymore.
Yeah, no, there's heaps to improve on. That's why we've both been doing it a while, and well, I don't know, maybe we're just obsessive about it. Like I think, like I say this all the time, there's literally like, there's always something to work on, isn't there? And something to learn, and in this sport. So you can take it wherever you want. That's the good thing about it, is you can go down a bit of a rabbit hole on a particular discipline or movement for a while, make those gains, and then come back and revisit some other stuff. Or you can kind of go broad and just be working on a bunch of different things at different points in time, So yeah, I think that's one of the good things about it.
Yeah, and I think what we started this conversation with, which is, we don't have the answers. There is no right or wrong way to do anything. is probably what keeps me coming back, because it's just every time a new client comes in, or there's a new, I mean, almost every day and every year, there's just new lessons on training and ways to do things that I'm like, well, when am I ever gonna have like
I want
the
to crack
magic
this
answer?
code. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. When can I hit copy and paste and be really successful with everyone?
Yeah.
And truth be told, it's never gonna happen.
When can I just dig up last year's program and just
Yeah, there you
redo
go.
it again?
Yeah, exactly. I love it.
Yeah.
Starry, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Hearing your thoughts on all this, and I always love speaking to other coaches. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. It's been great.
I'll say, Starry, can you tell us a little bit about where we can find you, where we can find more information about what you're doing, and if people want to be a part of your programming or your camps, how can they find you?
Yeah, if they just want to, my surname's Starr, Starr, and it's Starr Strength on Instagram, Starr_strength. If you just go there, you pretty much find everything. Starr Strength and Performance is the full name of the programming.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll put that in the show notes. I mean, I hope everyone's enjoyed the sound of my voice in this microphone. I'm still really very much enjoying it. Starry, I'm keeping you up late over there in Oz, but mate, really appreciate your time. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.